Hello everybody, welcome back. My name is Rowan Garlow. I'm a trauma recovery practitioner, and today we're talking about the inner child and inner child work. So I already have a video on shadow work and manifestation, but this is just going to be a little bit different because we're going to talk about how do we know that we're actually dealing with an inner child. What are some of the qualities that might present, or some of the states of being that might present, and what do we do? What is inner child work? Like, what does that even mean? So let's get into it. So the inner child is the aspect of our psyche that holds all of the memories, both good and bad, from our childhood. And here's the thing, as a child, up to a certain age, it's usually around 7, 8, or 9, depending on the person's development. Everything prior to that is filtered through an egocentric lens. And what that means is that all of the events that take place, we are filtering them through a self-based way of looking at the world. So that means that we're going to make situations mean things about us. So take, for example, a kid whose dad comes home all the time and he's angry at work. We're going to make that mean something about us because we don't have the capacity yet to see and perceive information outside of ourselves. So we don't know that maybe dad is stressed out because of financial reasons, or he's stressed out because of his boss or the people that he works with. We're really going to make it mean something about us. And why that's so important to understand is because all of these beliefs about ourselves that come out of these experiences, these early childhood experiences, they are what set up our subconscious programming. So that's why when people talk about things like shadow work, they're talking about the shadow or the subconscious, or what we don't know about ourselves. So how do we know that we're dealing with an inner child? Usually we're dealing with a trigger. So if you find a situation where it's really challenging for you to regulate your emotions or come out of a really activated state, or maybe you get flipped into anger and you don't know how to process or deal with that. So what we find is that a lot of adults have been coping. Well, really, it's actually these inner children that have learned how to cope with not knowing how to regulate their emotions implicitly, meaning internally. So oftentimes what we do is we develop coping mechanisms that externally or explicitly regulate our system. So that could be smoking a cigarette, having some coffee, looking at social media, just blocking out things altogether. Okay, so as I was saying, what does this look like in adulthood? This looks like an adult who doesn't know how to regulate their emotions. And so we literally have these parts of our psyche, these inner children, running the show. And they do it very automatically and very unconsciously. It's like an automatic program that we learned really, really early on. And how does that look? For some people it looks like dissociating, numbing out, behaviors like overeating, drugs, alcohol, social media, binge watching movies, anything to basically dissociate a person from how they're feeling. Or on the other end of the spectrum, we might see people fleeing, just straight up getting away, running, leaving situations without actually facing it. Or we might see something like a fight response, where the system is in chronic sympathetic arousal and constantly ready for something to happen. So all of those are ways that our system learned to deal with how to regulate emotions. And it is obviously not the most sophisticated technology that we're using. We're just using the best that we had. So when we talk about doing inner child work, what we're talking about is reparenting, in a sense. Because we're bringing our consciousness, you could call it the aware ego or the central I, online. And that observer self, or that awareness, is what can be in direct relationship to these vulnerabilities to these emotions, and we essentially have to learn how to reparent these inner kids, because if we let them ride the bus, they're just going to do what they've always done, unless there's some kind of awareness and connection from that aware ego. So when we look at the internal system, the simplest way to kind of map this out, just for the sake of this video, is you could think of like the inner child, and you have many inner children, but we'll just say the inner child, the inner parent, and the aware ego. Now, it's important to remember that the inner parents are modeled after our primary caregivers. And for most of us, that should probably scare us a little bit, because we're probably, God bless them, but our primary caregivers were pretty unconscious with what they were doing, and they didn't really know how to deal with emotions either. So not only do we have these inner parents that are managing or trying to manage our emotions the same way that our parents did, but they also are in relationship with other people that way. So you see this in bonding patterns. If you watch my bonding patterns video, how a lot of times we'll unconsciously farm our inner children out to other people, and they'll do the same, like our partners or something, or even friends sometimes. And then when they drop our kid, because we've given them this responsibility of taking care of this kid instead of taking care of it ourselves, then we have our internal parent that comes online. If, let's say, they drop the kid, they do something, an expectation gets dropped, something they were supposed to do for us, and then that inner parent comes in to defend that kid. But usually it does it the same way that our parent or one of our parents coped with situations. So maybe they give the cold shoulder, or maybe they just go in and start being antagonistic. And all the while, our inner kid is still not being taken care of. And all the while, then we say something and we mean to hit their parent, and it actually ends up hitting their inner kid. And so then their inner parent comes up, and then we just have two parents fighting with each other. So it's really important to become aware of what are the internal parents doing, what are their ways of trying to handle other people and handle ourselves, and how do our kids operate internally. And the way that we can begin to shift this is through, like I said, bringing an aware ego online. And aware ego is a process. So it's not a part, it's a process, it's a consciousness process that allows a person to hold polarity, to hold opposites, and then to take action from being informed by those polarities, by those internal polarities. And I should probably mention that, we have, because of these different selves that we have, this internal family system, some of ourselves, some of our inner kids, are really relational. They are interested in relationships with other people, and so they're going to be motivated by trying to maintain connection with other people. Maybe sometimes even at the cost of giving themselves up. And then we have other parts that are really interested in self-preservation. So they're interested in us and our best interest. And they don't really care about other people. They don't have linkage with other people. And this is important because a lot of times those polarities have different ideas or motivations behind why they're doing what they're doing. They both are trying to benefit the system, but they're going about it in different ways, because this one maybe wants to maintain the connection with other people, and this one really wants to maintain the connection to you. And from aware ego, if we can be conscious and hold both of those, there's oftentimes a third option that will arise, an organic third option that takes both of these into consideration. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're at work and you get really frustrated, you start to get really overwhelmed, something's going wrong, and you have one part of you that wants to freak out and wants to and you have one part of you that wants to run and hide in a corner somewhere. So being conscious and aware of both of those parts, we can turn our conscious awareness towards each of them and recognize what is the vulnerability here. Because that's inner child work. That's how we begin to reparent and meet the needs of these kids, is by understanding, well, what's going on? What's vulnerable about them? And meet and address that vulnerability and those unmet needs directly, instead of in these sort of covert ways that oftentimes end up harming other parts of us, or end up harming us, our system as a whole. Oh my God, this bird. So I'm going to give you another example. Let's say you're feeling sad, lonely, isolated, and you have a way that you normally deal with this. So let's say it's I go smoke a cigarette, or let's say it's I go and open the fridge and eat until I feel better. We have to slow down and pause, because these mechanisms operate so incredibly, like I said, it's unconscious. It just happens so fast. And a lot of times we feel like we are being taken over by the impulse. And that's because we are. We're literally being hijacked by that part of ourselves, which is why we have to slow it down and be very aware of, what am I feeling right now? Because part of reparenting ourselves is, honestly, in the beginning, it's about consciously. Because just expecting yourself to snap out of a way that you used to cope with your emotions into actually processing and integrating and being with your emotions, it's a journey. So for a lot of people, one of the in-between steps is to consciously cope. Meaning, okay, I recognize right now that I feel sad and lonely. And I recognize that I also want to cope by eating a bunch of food right now. Now, even though that might not be what I want to do, maybe I have some of my newer selves, newer consciousness online that's saying, that's created some problems for us, right? That coping mechanism oftentimes creates a new kind of vulnerability because it's covering over a wound. At first it was kind of a band-aid, and then the wound just got so big and so festering that this coping mechanism didn't really work anymore, and it ended up creating more vulnerabilities in the system. So let's say we recognize that that's not really what we want to do. At first, sometimes we might have to let ourselves do something consciously, be very aware of how you cope and how that thing is helping you. What does it feel like? Does it numb you out? Do I suddenly feel warm inside? Because that might point you to what the missing need is. And then we can start to get, over time, the more consciously that you do this, you'll also start to recognize the ways in which it isn't working for you. Like, what doesn't feel good about it, and really being there for that. And I know that shifts things for a lot of people to the point where they're like, all right, I guess this isn't really working anymore. Maybe I'll try something different. Okay, so I'm going to read a little passage that I wrote here about these different coping strategies that these inner children try to employ. So these are the agents that come to remedy or attempt to remedy the initial emotions like shame, isolation, overwhelm, anger, powerlessness, or fear, for example. All of these, of course, are the frozen or blocked emotions or aspects of us that need us to consciously be with them, the way that we needed someone to be with us in the past. So this is really important because we have to look at the ways in which our emotions were treated in childhood. Were you told to go to your room and cry it out? Were you told that, I'll give you something to cry about? Were you invalidated? Because one of the biggest things that blocks emotions or freezes them in the past, or causes us to split off from these parts of ourselves, which then get frozen in the past, is invalidation. It's the fact that we weren't even allowed to feel how we felt, and nor did we feel like it was valid to feel that way. So first and foremost, when we're doing inner child work, it's so important to validate how you feel. Now, there is a difference between validating something as a real perspective, so anything that a person feels is valid, because it is a direct reflection of how that person is interacting with and perceiving their reality. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So if you have a part of yourself, for example, that says, I feel really sad, I feel really lonely, I'm worthless, I must be not even worth being loved, or something like that, right? We can see that the perception is valid, the emotions are valid, but that the meaning that we're assigning to that which is, remember, as I was talking about at the beginning, how we filter experiences through and what we make them mean. As a child, we always make them mean something about us. We don't want to validate our inner kid and say, yeah, you're right, you're worthless, there's something wrong with you. But we can validate that the emotion makes perfect sense why it's there. Does that make sense? So here's something that can be really helpful, is to start to develop an internal mother and father. An internal divine mother and divine father, because these masculine and feminine energies, they operate differently. So get to know and be curious about, what would an ideal inner parent mother be like? What would an ideal inner father be like? How would they? And if you don't have an idea for what that would be like, maybe think about people that you grew up with or individuals that you know, like, oh yeah, I think that they would make a really good mom. Like, I really like the way that they handle people, or I like the way that that person is with kids. And then you can start to get an idea for what that energy is like. And that's really important, actually, because through parts work and things like that, you can actually begin to bring in, because those qualities, the universe is inside of you. So those qualities exist inside of you. So getting in touch with the aspect of you that contains some form of that energy, and then bringing and developing that and bringing it to your inner kids with this aware ego process is super cool. And it can create a lot of relief for these inner kids that feel totally powerless to emotions, or feel like emotions are so overwhelming. So if we feel like we're just, like, the emotion is like a tsunami and it's consuming us, that is a sure sign that we need reparenting, and that we need to directly connect with the inner child. And again, like I said, treat them the way that they should have been treated in the first place. And this next piece is not to shame anybody or to guilt anybody, because like I said, this is a life's work. But we have to look at the ways that we're coping and see, if a child were feeling the way that you felt right now, would you stuff food down that child's throat? Would you give them a cigarette? Would you shove a bottle of alcohol in their hand? Would you cut them open? No, you wouldn't. But that's how people deal with their inner kids, because that's how they were taught to deal with them. So if you've made it this far in the video, you probably already understand why we do inner child work. Why is this so important? But I'm going to read this little piece that I wrote here. Why do it? Because when we aren't conscious of something about ourselves, it is a mystery to us why things look the way that they do in our lives. We tend to project internally and externally when we are unaware of something about ourselves. We also tend to attract all kinds of things in the external world that continue to reflect our internal dissonance back to us. Meaning we tend to end up seeing or being a part of situations that reflect the aspects of ourselves we are seemingly unconscious of. Not to mention, and here is the good part, you guys, because this isn't all doom and gloom, not to mention all of the wonderful things that we gain from being in contact with our pure child selves. The play, the curiosity, the gems, the wisdom inherent in these kids. So when they split off from us and they get frozen in time, and they're operating out of constructs in the past, a lot of times they don't even know that you're grown up. Isn't that interesting? We have a lot of inner kids that don't even know that you have grown up, because they have had to pretend to be adults. And they've been running your life. They're like, oh, what do you mean she's an adult? Holy shit. And so unburdening those kids, like, hey, we're going to bring in some new energies. We're going to help to shift things around a little. We're going to give you some resources and some tools so that you can be a kid. So that you can have that energy freed up in your system to play, to do what a kid does. So some examples of inner child work or shadow work are Jungian shadow work, the completion process, internal family systems, parts work, voice dialogue, somatic experiencing, soul retrieval, or just straight up unconditional presence. So, and there's a ton more than that, but that's just what I'm going to list for today. So here's what we do in an inner child. This is a really just basic understanding of what we do in inner child work. Awareness and presence, number one, for the early selves and for the programs that are running. We then use these triggers to alert us to what needs our attention. We then understand how we feel and how these younger parts of us feel. We validate their experience and guide them through it with this unconditional presence that we're developing. And then we understand what becomes apparent while we're with them. What does this inner child need? And we can do this in a really long, drawn-out process where we go really deep, or we can do this in just a short process throughout the day, like just tiny. What's going on? Oh, start communicating with these selves. Step over a little bit. Okay, how does this part of me feel? Just let it speak. Listen. What is it needing? Right? But we have to be willing to shift and make the shifts to accommodate those needs. So some of the things that I have noticed within myself and within clients and other people that I work with as a result of doing inner child work or shadow work is that they have a clearer perception of themselves and of other people because they're no longer shrouded in programming, which makes it very difficult to see and sometimes even think clearly. More energy, vitality, healthier, more maturity, better relationships. And when I say more energy and healthier, I mean it's because you are literally bringing energy into your body that you didn't have before. So when trauma happens, our psyche or our consciousness splits and it fragments. And when something goes unconscious or subconscious, meaning it's not available to our conscious mind, it means that that stream or that source of energy has split. So when we reintegrate that into the stream that is our consciousness, we actually are getting more of our life essence back. That's huge. I know that Teal Swan just put out a video on inner child work a couple days ago actually. And she did a really great exercise in there, which is a great way to get all of this information, which is like, okay, we just learned information, great. To get it into an embodied practice of some kind, to really start to actually dig into the meat of that instead of even waiting for a trigger. You don't have to wait for a trigger to connect to your inner children. And the exercise that she offers up is to write a letter with your non-dominant hand from your inner child. So allow an inner child, any inner child, whichever one wants to come up, to take over, to say, okay, and you could step over even, like I do with parts work, step over and say, okay, I choose with my conscious free will to allow an inner child to come through. And then you do non-dominant handwriting because that's linked to the subconscious, or you could do a voice note or something like that, or a video recording if that works better for you. But I think writing for a lot of people works quite well. So try that out. See what comes forward, and you could do that 1,000 times, like she says in the video. You could do it 100 times, it doesn't matter. And you might find out a lot of really interesting information about yourself. We have a lot of, like what I said earlier, okay? We tend to project internally and externally. What I mean by that is we tend to think that we know what selves are doing or what they're like or what their motivations are, but a lot of times it's really different, actually, than what we think it might be. So we just have to connect to that part and find out and ask them, what's going on? What is this child self saying to me now? Because I bet it has a lot of wisdom. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Sending you all my best. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And do not forget that I host monthly workshops every month, a different theme. January is dissolving your external authorities, basically reclaiming yourself and reclaiming your sovereignty. And yeah, check it out. If it interests you, be happy to have you join. Otherwise, I do them every month. So you just go to my website at rowangarlow.com and you can check out what the latest workshops are, as well as packages and things for working with me one-on-one. So be well, and I will see you in the next video.